The council chamber of the High Sovereignty was a cathedral of cold light and ancient indifference. It was a space designed to make you feel small, constructed from obsidian glass and floating platforms that hovered like frozen predators. For 12 years, I had sat in the back row, a shadow in a crisp uniform, watching the masters of the galaxy play a game of chess where the pieces were star systems and the pawns were people. Silence, however, was our greatest weapon. We had been the quietest species in the room. We filed our papers. We paid our dues. We smiled when the Thraxian delegates called us the clever little apes from the rim. We let them think we were contained. But today, the silence was different. I stood behind Grand Admiral Thorne as he faced the 49 representatives of the great houses. Thorne didn't look like a diplomat. He looked like a man carved out of a dying star. His uniform was black, devoid of the colorful sashes or medals the other species flaunted. He held a single holographic data shard in his hand, and he looked at the Thraxian ambassador, a creature of chitin and gold-plated armor, with a gaze that could have stripped the hull off a frigate. The High Arbiter, a floating crystalline entity known as the Echo of Ages, vibrated with a melodic tone. The humans seek an audience regarding the incident at the Kalyx-4 outpost? Incident, Thorne whispered, the word sounding like a terminal diagnostic. I felt the weight of the memory hit me then, pulling me back to where it all began. It had been 3 a.m, ship time, aboard the Vigilant. We were drifting on the edge of the Viridian Fringe, a quiet sector of space where the only thing to do was count the nebulae and wait for the coffee to brew. I was on the tactical bridge, monitoring a dull stream of freight traffic, when the console screamed. It wasn't a standard alert. It was a Priority 0 distress ping. In our Navy, we called it the heartbeat. It only triggers when a colony's central core is manually overloaded to bypass planetary jamming. It skips every filter, every officer's queue, and lands directly on the commander's desk with a single crimson pulse. Captain Thorne was on the bridge in 4 minutes, still buttoning his jacket. His eyes went to the screen immediately. "Origin!" he barked. "Kalyx-4, sir," I replied, my fingers dancing across the neural lace interface. "It is a moon-based agrarian outpost. Oakhaven. 4,200 settlers." The screen flickered. The signal had lasted exactly 14 seconds. No voice, no video. Just the raw, jagged data of a distress call cut short by a high-energy dampening field. "The Thraxian high-order signature," I said, my voice shaking just enough for me to notice. It was unmistakable. Their jump drives leave a specific ionizing trail, like a greasy thumbprint on the fabric of space. They didn't even try to hide it. Thorne didn't ask about survivors. He didn't ask about the cargo. He looked at the sensor logs and saw the count. 912. That was the number of inhabitants under the age of 16 on Oakhaven. He knew the manifest of every colony in his sector. He was a man who memorized the names of the people he was paid to protect. "Contact the Sovereignty Liaison," Thorne ordered. "Tell them a member species has committed an act of piracy." "Sir," I had said, looking at the clock. "The Sovereignty's response time for a diplomatic inquiry is 3 weeks. The paperwork alone for a border dispute takes a month." Thorne turned to me then. His face was a mask of stone. "I am not filing a border dispute, Vance. I am giving the galaxy a chance to apologize." We jumped 10 minutes later. The Vigilant was a light frigate, fast but fragile, a needle in a haystack of giants. As we tore through the fold of space, the bridge was silent. There was no chatter, no nervous jokes. Every sailor on that ship knew what was on Kalyx-4. It wasn't gold. It wasn't rare minerals. It was our children. By the time we exited the fold, the moon of Kalyx-4 was a pale, sickly green hanging in the void. From orbit, the colony of Oakhaven looked peaceful. The lights of the central hub were still on, twinkling like fallen stars against the dark soil of the farmlands. The irrigation systems were still spraying water over the fields of genetically modified grain. But there were no ships in the hangars. There were no people in the streets. "Scan for life signs," Thorne commanded. I ran the sweep once, then twice. I recalibrated the sensors, thinking the Thraxian dampeners were still active. I pushed the power to the limits, the heat from the console warming my hands. "Commander?" Thorne asked. "Zero, sir," I whispered. Not a single biosign in the entire settlement. They had been efficient. They hadn't bombarded the moon. They hadn't burned the crops. They had simply walked into the homes, taken everyone who mattered, and left the buildings standing like headstones in a graveyard. Back in the council chamber, years later, the Thraxian ambassador let out a clicking sound that the translator interpreted as a bored sigh. "The recovery of indentured dependence is a lawful action under the debt of ages," the creature stated, its mandibles twitching. "The human colony of Oakhaven failed to meet the tribute quota for the harvest season. Under the Sovereignty Code, we are entitled to collateral." "Collateral," Thorne said. "You took children from their beds because of a grain quota they never knew existed." The ambassador shifted, his gold-plated armor clinking. "They are being treated with the respect due to their status as property. They are being held at the Thrax Narath facility. They are warm. They are fed. The law is satisfied." Thorne stepped forward. The crystalline arbiter vibrated. "Does the human representative have a formal counterproposal?" Thorne didn't look at the arbiter. He looked at the Thraxian. "I am not here to propose," he said, his voice dropping to a low, guttural vibration. "I am here to inform. You have 48 hours to return every single one of those children to a neutral station, unharmed, without a single scratch on their skin or a single tear in their eyes." The room erupted. The other species, the avian Volturians, the bioluminescent deep dwellers, all began to chatter and pulse with indignation. 48 hours? The Thraxian ambassador mocked. "And if we do not, you will file another report? You will sit in your two little chairs and wait for a subcommittee to review your grievances? You are number 41 in this council, human. You are a footnote." Thorne reached into his jacket. He didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a small, charred object and set it on the obsidian table. It was a holographic projector, the kind kids used to show stories before bed. It was cracked, the casing melted by a Thraxian stun baton. "This belonged to a girl named Rin," Thorne said. "She was 5. She liked stories about stars that didn't want to be lonely." He looked around the room, making eye contact with every ancient, powerful being in that chamber. "If the children are not returned in 48 hours, I will not be the one you talk to next. And the silence you have enjoyed from humanity for 30 years. He paused, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something terrifying in his eyes. "That silence is over." He turned and walked out. I followed him, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As we reached the transit bay, I looked at him. "Sir, the council will censure us. They might even expel us." Thorne didn't stop. "Let them," he said. "They think the law is a shield. They're about to find out it's a cage. Vance, tell the fleet to wake up. All of them. Even the ones they think don't exist." "Yes, Admiral. And Vance?" "Sir?" "Keep that toy," he said, gesturing to the projector in my hand. "We're going to need it to remind us why we're about to burn the sky." The air on Kalyx-4 tasted like ozone and abandoned dreams. I stepped off the shuttle, my boots crunching on the dry, tilled earth of Oakhaven. It was 6 in the morning local time, The sun was just beginning to peek over the jagged horizon of the moon, casting long, distorted shadows across the farmsteads. In any other week, this would have been the hour of life. The sound of tractors warming up, the shouting of children heading to the central schoolhouse, the smell of baking bread from the communal kitchens. Now, there was only the wind whistling through the stalks of grain and the distant hum of the automated water pumps. I was leading a forensic team, but we all felt like intruders in a tomb. We were looking for evidence, though the Thraxians hadn't even bothered to scrub their tracks. They didn't think they needed to. Why hide your footprints when you believe you own the floor? Captain Thorne was walking 20 meters ahead of us, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't looking at the ground. He was looking at the doors. Every single one of them was wide open. "Sir," Sergeant Miller called out from the doorway of a small, white-roofed house. "You need to see this." We entered. The kitchen was a snapshot of a life interrupted. 3 bowls of oatmeal sat on the table. One was still half full, a spoon resting against the rim. A chair had been knocked over, lying on its side. On the wall, a digital calendar blinked, marking today as the Harvest Festival. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle. The Thraxians used neural gas, a sophisticated toxin that paralyzes the motor functions while keeping the consciousness fully alert. It's a clean way to harvest property. The victims watch as they are carried away, unable to blink, unable to scream, their minds screaming behind frozen eyes. I walked toward the back of the house. The children's room was painted a soft blue. 2 small beds were neatly made, but the sheets were rumpled at the top, pulled back in haste. On the floor lay a stuffed animal, a lopsided bear with a missing eye. I picked it up. The fabric was still slightly warm from the heating unit in the floor. "How long has it been, Vance?" Thorne asked. He was standing in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the morning light. 18 hours since the signal," I replied. "At standard cargo speeds, the Thraxian transport would be halfway to their border by now." He walked over to the window. Outside, the schoolhouse stood on a small hill. The playground equipment, a set of swings, a slide, sat motionless in the cold air. "They think we are a math problem," Thorne said, his voice barely a whisper. "They looked at our population, our ship count, our lack of ancient technology, and they calculated that the cost of taking our children was lower than the cost of negotiating with us." I looked at the stuffed bear in my hand. "They forgot one variable, sir." "What's that?" "We don't care about the cost," I said. Thorne nodded once. It was a sharp, clinical movement. "Come on. We're done here. There's nothing left to find but ghosts." As we walked back to the shuttle, my comms unit chirped. It was Lieutenant Ilara, our signals officer, back on the Vigilant. "Captain, we have a response from the Sovereignty Council." "Put it through," Thorne said. The voice that came through the speakers was smooth, oily, and dripping with condescension. "This is High Counselor Vallis. Captain Thorne, your unauthorized deployment to the Kalyx system is a violation of the Sector 4 protocols. We have received the Thraxian report." While the method of debt collection was abrupt, it is technically within their sovereign rights. You are ordered to stand down and return to Earth orbit immediately. A mediation session has been scheduled for 3 months from now. Thorne stopped walking. He looked up at the sky, where the faint shimmer of our ship was visible against the stars. "Counselor Vallis," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I have 900 children missing from this moon. I have a schoolhouse full of empty desks. Do you have children, Counselor?" There was a pause. "The Council's business is not personal, Captain. The stability of the Accord relies on the rule of law. If humanity chooses to act outside that law, you will be treated as a rogue species. Do you understand the implications?" Thorne looked at me, then at the sergeant, then at the empty colony behind us. "I understand perfectly," Thorne said. "You're telling me that as long as it's legal, you'll watch us burn." "That is a crude interpretation," the counselor snapped. Thorne didn't reply. He clicked the comm link shut. "Vance," he said, turning to me, "Sir? When we get back to the ship, I want you to open a wide-band transmission. Don't encrypt it. I want the Thraxians to hear it. I want the Council to hear it. I want the whole damn galaxy to hear it." "What am I sending, sir?" "The heartbeat signal," Thorne said. "The distress call from Oakhaven. Loop it, over and over. And then, I want you to broadcast the coordinates of the Thraxian border station at Aegis 9. "Sir, that's a military installation," I said, my heart skipping a beat. "It's one of the most heavily fortified stations in the Sovereignty." "I know," Thorne said, stepping onto the shuttle ramp. "They think they're the only ones who can collect a debt. We're going to show them that humanity has been keeping a ledger for a long time." He paused at the top of the ramp, looking back one last time at the silent moon of Kalyx-4. "Tell the crew to prep the ghost drives. We're not going to wait 3 months. We're going to be there by dinner." As the shuttle lifted off, the dust of Oakhaven swirled beneath us. I looked down at the stuffed bear I had tucked into my tactical belt. I thought about the children in the Thraxian transport, frozen by gas, watching the stars go by and wondering if anyone was coming. I realized then that Thorne was right. The galaxy had spent 30 years watching us be quiet. They had mistaken our patience for peace. They had mistaken our silence for submission. They were about to learn that when a human stops talking, it's not because they've run out of words. It's because they've started counting. On the flight back to the Vigilant, the atmosphere was electric. We weren't just a patrol ship anymore. We were the first spark in a fire that was about to consume the Viridian Fringe. I sat at my station, my fingers flying across the holographic displays, waking up systems that had been dormant for a decade. We had ships the Council didn't know about. We had weapons they hadn't seen since the old wars on Earth. We had been the clever little apes for 12 years, and in that time we had learned every weakness in their superior technology. "Admiral, the ghost drives are at 100%, I reported. Thorne sat in his command chair, the toy projector still sitting on the console beside him. He looked like a king of old, ready to go to a war he knew he might not survive. "Target Aegis 9, he said. "Sir, the Council is hailing us again," Ilara shouted. "They're threatening to send a peacekeeping fleet to intercept us." Thorne didn't even look at the screen. "Tell them to bring a big enough bucket," he said, "because the fire we're starting doesn't go out with words." He looked at the viewport as the stars began to stretch into the long white lines of a jump. "Punch it, Vance." The Vigilant vanished from the Kalyx system, leaving nothing behind but the silence of an empty moon and the echoing heartbeat of a distress call that wouldn't stop screaming. The echoes of Grand Admiral Thorne's footsteps had barely faded from the council chamber when the shouting began. From my position near the exit, I watched the floating platforms of the High Sovereignty descend into a chaotic swarm of colors and light. The avian Vulturians screeched in high-pitched frequencies that the translation filters struggled to stabilize, while the deep dwellers pulsed with frantic rhythmic flashes of bioluminescence. To them, we were no longer the quiet observer species. We were a glitch in their ancient, orderly machine. I checked the chronometer on my wrist. 34 minutes had passed since the ultimatum. In 47 hours and 26 minutes, the clock would hit 0. The High Arbiter, that crystalline entity that looked more like a jagged mountain of glass than a living being, hummed a low, vibrating note that eventually silenced the room. "The human representative has left the floor," The voice resonated. Their demand is recorded. The Council will now deliberate on the appropriate sanctions for such insolence. Sanctions? I whispered to myself, a bitter taste in my mouth. They were discussing fines and trade embargoes while 900 children were being logged into a Thraxian database as agricultural machinery. I felt the heavy vibration of a private comlink in my inner ear. Vance, get to the transit bay. Now. It was Thorne. He sounded like he was already moving at a dead run. I slipped out of the chamber, ignoring the glares from the Thraxian guards standing at the perimeter. They were tall, four-armed brutes, with exoskeletons that shimmered like oil on water. One of them shifted his heavy pulse staff toward me, a silent threat. I didn't flinch. I just looked at the cracked sensor visor of his helmet and thought about the blue room on Kalyx-4. I thought about the lopsided bear. When I reached the transit bay, Thorne was already boarding our diplomatic shuttle. 2 other officers were with him, looking pale and wide-eyed. They were the career diplomats, the ones who had spent 15 years learning how to bow and which fork to use at a Thraxian state dinner. "Admiral, you can't be serious," one of them stammered. Her name was Leora, and she had been our chief negotiator for 5 years. "You just threatened the most powerful military hegemony in the known galaxy. They will erase us. They will decimate our trade routes and blockade Earth." Thorne didn't look at her. He was staring at a tactical map on his handheld pad. "They already erased us, Leora. They did it the second they walked into a nursery and decided those lives had a price tag in grain." "But there are protocols," she cried. "We can appeal to the Vulturian Trade Commission. We can file a stay of execution under the Third Solar Accord." Thorne finally looked up. His eyes were cold, 2 chips of flint in a face of weathered granite. "Leora, how many times have we filed an appeal in the last 10 years? 412 times, Admiral. And how many times did the Council rule in our favor?" Leora hesitated. "Twice. On minor waste management disputes in Sector 7. "Exactly," Thorne said, turning back to the map. "The law is a tool for those who already have the hammer. We've spent 30 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was designed to keep us on the floor." "Vance, status of the Vigilant?" "She's hot-mic'd and ready, sir," I said, falling into the familiar rhythm of military brevity. "Ghost drives are cycled to 90%. The rest of the sector patrol is bird-dogging the Thraxian border as ordered." "Good. Tell them to tighten the net." "I want every Thraxian scout ship within 3 light years to feel like they're being watched by a ghost." As the shuttle detached from the Sovereign Station and drifted into the velvet black of the void, I looked back at the massive structure. It was beautiful, a ring of silver and light that housed 1 trillion lives and 1 billion laws. And yet, it felt like a hollow shell. We arrived at the Vigilant 10 minutes later. The atmosphere on the bridge was tense enough to snap a wire. Every screen was alive with scrolling data, thermal signatures, and long-range scans of the Thraxian border. "Report!" Thorne barked as he stepped onto the command deck. Lieutenant Ilara turned from her console, her face illuminated by the green glow of the radar sweep. "Sir, the Thraxians haven't blinked. Their border station at Aegis 9 has increased its shield output by 20%. They've also scrambled 2 squadrons of interceptors. They're calling our bluff, sir. They think we're just making noise to get a better seat at the mediation table." Thorne walked to the center of the bridge and stood over the primary tactical display. "Aegis 9 isn't just a border station, is it, Vance?" "No, sir," I said, pulling up the intelligence files. "It's a logistics hub. It's where they process assets from the fringe before moving them to the Thraxian homeworlds. If the children from Oakhaven are anywhere, they're there." Ilara looked at the map, her brow furrowed. "Admiral, That station has enough firepower to slag a moon. It's shielded by a dual-phase graviton net. Even if we jumped in with everything we have, we'd be space dust before we cleared the first perimeter. Thorne leaned forward, his hands flat on the console. Only if they see us coming. Vance, activate the blackout protocol. The bridge went deathly quiet. Ilara froze, her hands hovering over her keyboard. Sir? The blackout protocol is... That's a Level 5 violation of the Sovereignty Technology Act. If we use that, there's no going back. We'll be marked as a rogue military force. Thorne looked at the lopsided bear I had placed on the corner of the command console. The stuffed animal looked absurd in the high-tech environment of a starship, out of place among the glowing buttons and steel. The Thraxians think they know our math, Thorne said. They've spent 30 years counting our ships and measuring our engines. They think we're a known quantity. They think we're afraid of the dark. He looked around the bridge, making eye contact with every young officer. Most of them were under 30. Most of them had families back on Earth or on the Rim colonies. They were the generation that had grown up in the shadow of the sovereignty, taught to be grateful for the crumbs of trade and the protection of ancient empires. Vance, what is the core mission of the United Earth Expeditionary Command? Thorne asked. To protect the sovereignty and future of the human species, sir, I replied automatically. The future, Thorne repeated. Not the trade routes, not the diplomatic standing. The future. And the future is currently sitting in a cold room on Aegis 9, wondering why their parents haven't come for them. He straightened his jacket, the fabric crisp and black. We've been the quietest species in the galaxy for 30 years. We've been the polite neighbors who don't complain when the music is too loud. We've been the observers who take notes, while others take lives. He paused, and his voice took on a grit that made the hair on my neck stand up. Well, the neighbors are tired of being polite, and the observers have seen enough. Ilara, activate the protocol. Vance, get us into the fold. We're going to Aegis 9, and we're not going there to talk. Yes, sir, Ilara whispered, her fingers finally moving. The bridge lights shifted from a cool blue to a deep, predatory red. The hum of the engines changed, moving from a steady thrum to a high-pitched whine that vibrated in my teeth. On the main screen, the Ghost Drive interface appeared, a complex web of shifting geometries that bypassed the standard jump gates of the sovereignty. We weren't using their roads anymore. We were cutting our own path through the static of the universe. As the Vigilant prepared to jump, I thought about the Thraxian ambassador's face in the council chamber. He had looked so certain. He had looked so safe in his golden armor. He truly believed that we were just a footnote in a history book he had already finished writing. He didn't know that humans are at our most dangerous when we stop trying to win the argument and start trying to end the problem. Hold on to something, people, I called out to the bridge crew. It's about to get bumpy. The stars outside the viewport didn't just stretch, they shattered. We dove into the fold, a black-on-black void where the laws of physics felt more like suggestions. For 3 minutes, the ship groaned under the pressure of the Ghost Drive, the hull plates screaming as we tore through dimensions that weren't meant for biological life. And then, with a bone-shaking jolt, we were out. Aegis 9 loomed ahead of us, a massive, jagged fortress of obsidian and gold, orbiting a dying red star. It was beautiful, in a terrible, cold way. Hundreds of lights flickered along its surface, and the graviton shield shimmered like a veil of diamonds in the dark. "Status?" Thorne asked, his voice steady. "We're in the shadow of their primary sensor array, sir," I said, checking the tactical feed. "They don't know we're here yet. Our heat signature is flat-lined. To their computers, we're just a piece of space debris." "Ilara, Scan for the children, Thorne ordered. Use the narrow-band resonance. Look for human DNA signatures in the logistics tier. There was a tense silence as Alara worked. The only sound on the bridge was the steady beep of the life support system and the soft whir of the cooling fans. I watched the Thraxian interceptors on the screen, drifting in their lazy patrol patterns 2,000 kilometers away. They were so confident. They were bugging out on their comms, probably joking about the angry apes in the council. "I have them," Alara whispered, her voice cracking. "Oh, God! Admiral, I have them!" Thorne leaned over her shoulder. "Location: Logistics, Tier 4, Storage Block 12. Sir, they're not in cells. They're in biostasis crates. They've been processed as perishable inventory." The silence that followed was heavier than the void outside. I felt a cold, sharp rage bloom in my chest, a fire that burned away every doubt I had ever had about this mission. They weren't even treating them as prisoners. They were cargo. They were objects to be stacked and shipped and sold. Thorne's face didn't change, but his eyes went dark, the color of a storm-tossed sea. "Vance, ready the extraction teams. Tell Lucy Hayden she has 10 minutes to get those kids onto the shuttles once we breach the hull." "Breach the hull, sir?" Alara asked. "We're one ship. Their internal security will be on us in seconds." Thorne looked at the massive station, then at the 14 other blips that suddenly appeared on our tactical map, the rest of our sector patrol, jumping in on our Ghost Drive coordinates. "We're not one ship anymore, Alara," Thorne said, "and we're not here to talk about the law." He turned to me, his jaw set in a hard line. "Vance, target their primary power core. Use the phase pulse rounds. I want this station dark in 60 seconds. Aye, Admiral," I said, my fingers flying across the targeting interface. I looked at the Thraxian station, that monument to arrogance and civilized cruelty. I thought about the girl Rin and her stories about stars that didn't want to be lonely. Today, I thought, the stars are going to have plenty of company. "Fire," Thorne commanded. The Vigilant bucked as the phase pulse rounds left the tubes, streaking through the dark like bolts of artificial lightning. The war had begun, and for the first time in 30 years, we were the ones writing the first chapter. The first phase pulse round hit the Aegis 9 power grid with the force of a collapsing star. On our tactical screen, the shimmering diamond veil of the Thraxian graviton shields didn't just flicker. It disintegrated. It was like watching a pane of glass hit by a sledgehammer. One moment, the station was an impenetrable fortress of obsidian and gold. The next, it was a naked, vulnerable hunk of metal drifting in the shadow of a dying sun. Everything on the station went dark. The thousands of lights along its jagged hull vanished, replaced by the dull red glow of emergency backup systems. The massive ion cannons that had been tracking our patrol fleet stalled in their mounts, their targeting computers blind and confused. "Target neutralized," I reported, my voice sounding strangely calm over the roar of the engines. "Power grid is at 5% capacity. Their internal sensors are flat-lined. They're blind, deaf, and dumb, sir." Thorne didn't waste a second. "Extraction teams, go. Lucy, you're Oscar Mike. You have the floor." "Copy that, Admiral." Lucy Hayden's voice crackled through the comms. She sounded like she was chewing on a piece of gum, her tone as casual as if she were heading out for a morning jog instead of leading a high-risk boarding action against a superior alien species. "Dropping in 5, 4, 3, 2, breach." On the main viewport, 3 sleek, black-hulled drop shuttles detached from the Vigilant and the Hawksbridge. They didn't use docking ports. They didn't ask for permission. They used thermal lances to melt through the hull of Logistics Tier 4, creating their own doors in the side of the Thraxian station. I watched the tactical feed from Lucy's helmet cam. It was a chaotic blur of flickering red emergency lights and white steam from the breached hull. Her team moved with a terrifying, synchronized precision, humanity's finest, trained in the shadows for a conflict the Council said would never happen. "Clear left," one of the soldiers shouted. "Contact, 2 chitheads at 12 o'clock. The chitheads, our slang for the Thraxians, were caught completely off guard. In the flickering red light of the corridor, I saw 2 Thraxian guards, their forearms scrambling to raise their pulse staffs. They were massive, armored, and ancient. They had spent centuries believing they were the predators of this sector. They didn't stand a chance. Lucy's team didn't use the loud, clumsy kinetic weapons of the past. They used high-frequency sonic disruptors and localized EMP charges. The Thraxians dropped like stones, their neural laces overloaded by the sudden surge of human electronic warfare. "Don't kill them if you don't have to," Lucy's voice came through, calm and steady. "We're not here for a body count. We're here for the inventory." I felt a shiver go down my spine at the word inventory. It was the Thraxians' word, thrown back at them with a cold, sharp edge. The team reached storage block 12 in under 4 minutes. The door was a massive slab of reinforced alloy, locked by a biometric scanner that required a Thraxian handprint. "Vance, I need a key," Lucy said. "I'm on it," I replied. My fingers danced across the neural lace interface, weaving through the Thraxian security subroutines. Their systems were ancient, built on layers of tradition and arrogance. They hadn't updated their encryption in 60 years because they didn't think anyone would ever have the balls to challenge them. It took me 12 seconds to find the bypass. The slab of alloy hissed and slid upward, revealing the interior of Block 12. I stopped breathing. The room was vast, a cavernous space filled with rows upon rows of silver, coffin-shaped crates. They were stacked 10 high, held in place by magnetic tethers. Each crate had a small, flickering status light and a digital manifest. Asset ID H09er2. Type: immature, biological. Status: stasis. "My God," Alara whispered from the comms station. "There are so many." Lucy Hayden walked toward the nearest crate. She wiped the frost from the small viewing port on the top. Inside, the face of a young boy, no older than 7, was visible. His eyes were closed, his skin pale under the blue stasis glow. He looked like he was sleeping, but there was a tension in his jaw, a remnant of the moment the neural gas had hit him. "He's alive," Lucy said, her voice softening for the first time. "He's okay. Team, start the transfer. We're moving them crate by crate. Be careful with the mag tethers. These kids are fragile." As the extraction team began the painstaking process of moving 900 stasis crates onto the shuttles, the rest of the galaxy finally started to wake up. "Admiral, we have incoming!" Alara shouted. "Thraxian garrison fleet jumping in from the 3rd system. 44 signatures. They're coming in hot mic and weapons hot." Thorne turned to the tactical display. The red blips were appearing at the edge of our sensor range, a swarm of Thraxian warships 3 times the size of our patrol fleet. They were heavy, lumbering beasts, bristling with ion cannons and missile tubes. "Thraxians always bring a sledgehammer to a fly swatting," Thorne muttered. "They think volume wins the day." "Vance, what's the ETA on that fleet?" 6 minutes until they're in firing range, sir," I said, my heart hammering. "We can't finish the extraction in 6 minutes. We have 900 kids to move." "Then we buy some time," Thorne said. He turned to the fleet channel. "All ships, this is the Admiral. We are at Whiskey Hotel. Form up on the Vigilant. We are the Wall. Nothing gets past us until those shuttles are clear." The 14 ships of our patrol moved into formation. We were a tiny line of silver against the encroaching darkness of the Thraxian fleet. On paper, it was suicide. A single Thraxian cruiser had more hull plating than our entire fleet combined. But we had something they didn't. We had spent 30 years being the clever little apes, and we had spent every one of those years studying how to kill giants. One of the Thraxian cruisers, a massive beast called the Eternal Sovereign, opened a channel. The face of a Thraxian commander appeared on our main screen. He was old, his chitinous skin graying at the edges of his mandibles. "Human," he clicked, the translator struggling with his rage. "You have committed an act of war. You have violated a sovereign logistics hub. You will power down your engines and surrender your vessels for scuttling. If you do not, we will reduce your ships to slag and salt your home world." Thorne looked at the Thraxian with the same expression he'd use to look at a smudge on his boot. "Commander, I gave your ambassador 48 hours. He chose to spend 34 of them laughing. Now, the time for jokes is over." The Thraxian let out a screeching laugh. "You are 14 tin cans, human. We are 44 ships of the high hegemony. Do the math." Thorne leaned forward, his eyes locked on the Thraxians. "I already did the math, Commander, and I think you're going to find that humans are very bad at subtraction." He cut the channel. "Vance, activate the Ghost Mirror." The Ghost Mirror was our most secret piece of tech, a development from the Asteroid Belt Labs that used localized graviton warping to create phantom signatures. To the Thraxian sensors, our 14 ships suddenly became 140. The tactical screen turned into a chaotic mess of ghost signals, every one of them looking like a fully armed human cruiser. The Thraxian fleet faltered. They stopped their hard burn, their commanders frantically trying to recalibrate their sensors. They were confused, their ancient strategies unable to account for a species that could play with the fabric of reality. "Fire at will," Thorne said. The space between the two fleets erupted in a storm of light. We didn't fire in broadsides like the Thraxians. We fired in surgical, high-frequency bursts, targeting their engine manifolds and sensor domes. We were like a swarm of hornets attacking a blind bear. Pete Callow's ship, the Hawksbridge, was at the front of the line. I watched his sensor feed as he wove through the Thraxian fire, his pilot reflexes sharpened by years of zero-G racing. He was laughing over the comms, a wild, reckless sound that made me smile despite the terror. "Check your 6, Sarge," Pete shouted to his tactical officer. "I'm going in for a hard burn on that cruiser's belly." He dived under the massive bulk of a Thraxian destroyer, his phase pulse cannons carving a glowing red line through its underbelly. The destroyer bucked, its atmosphere venting into the void in a spray of glittering ice crystals. "One down," Pete crowed. "Who's next?" But for every hit we landed, the Thraxians landed too. Our shields were screaming under the pressure of their ion fire. The Vigilant shook with a bone-grinding jolt as a pulse round clipped our starboard nacelle. "Hull integrity at 80%, Ilara shouted. "We can't hold this line forever, sir." Thorne didn't look at the damage reports. He was looking at the extraction feed. "Lucy, status?" 750 crates loaded, Admiral." Lucy's voice was strained now. "We're taking fire inside the station. The garrison troops have reached the logistics tier." "Get them out," Thorne ordered. "Even if you have to leave the shuttles and jump into the void, get those kids to the Vigilant." The next 5 minutes were a blur of fire and noise. The Vigilant was a dance of light, our ghost mirrors flickering as our power reserves drained. The Thraxians were starting to figure out the trick, their fire becoming more concentrated on our real signatures. And then, the voice we had been waiting for came through the comms. "This is Hayden. "We are clear! All 900 assets are on board. I repeat, the inventory is secure." Thorne's shoulders dropped an inch, a tiny release of tension that only I noticed. "All ships, scuttle the ghost mirrors and prepare for a combat jump," he commanded. "We're bugging out." But the Thraxians weren't going to let us go that easily. The Eternal Sovereign had moved into a blocking position, its massive gravity well generators spinning up to trap us in the system. If those generators reached full power, we wouldn't be able to jump. We'd be sitting ducks. "I'm on it," Pete Callow said. His ship, the Hawksbridge, was the closest to the cruiser. "Admiral, I'm going to draw their fire. You get the kids home." "Pete, no!" Thorne shouted. The Hawksbridge didn't turn back. It accelerated, its engines redlining as it dove straight for the cruiser's gravity well generator. It was a suicide run, a desperate gamble to knock out the one thing keeping us trapped. I watched the screen, my heart in my throat. The Hawksbridge was a tiny spark of light against the massive obsidian wall of the cruiser. It took hit after hit, its shields failing, its hull plates peeling away like charred paper. But Pete didn't stop. He pushed the engines until they were screaming, and in a final, brilliant burst of fire, he rammed his ship directly into the glowing core of the gravity well generator. The explosion was beautiful and terrible. A white-hot shockwave rippled through the Thraxian fleet, throwing their ships into a tumbling chaos. The gravity well collapsed, the space around us suddenly clear and open. "Pete," I whispered, staring at the empty space where the Hawksbridge had been. There was no debris, no escape pods, just a lingering ghost signal that faded into the static of the void. He was gone. The loudest, funniest man in the fleet had just become a part of the silence he had spent his life trying to fill. Thorne closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Jump," he said. The Vigilant tore into the fold, leaving the burning remains of Aegis 9 and the shattered Thraxian fleet behind. We had the children, all 900 of them, but as I sat at my console, the blue lopsided bear still sitting on the edge of the screen, the victory felt like ashes. We were heading home, but the cost of the ticket had just been paid in blood. And I knew, as the ship groaned under the pressure of the ghost drive, that the Thraxians weren't the only ones who were going to have to learn a lesson today. The lesson was simple. To save the future, you have to be willing to lose the present. I looked at Thorne. He was staring at the viewport, his reflection a ghost in the glass. He looked older than he had 10 minutes ago. He looked like a man who had just traded his soul for 900 lives. "Admiral?" I asked softly. He didn't turn around. "Get some coffee, Vance," he said, his voice as dry as dust. "We still have 15 days of work to do." "15 days, sir?" Ilara asked. "The kids are safe. We're going home." Thorne finally turned. He looked at the bridge crew, at the young men and women who had just seen their first real war. "We're not just going home," he said. "The Thraxians took our children because they thought we were weak. They thought they could ignore our laws because we were quiet. If we stop now, they'll just wait another 10 years and do it again." He pointed to the tactical map, where the rest of the Thraxian military installations were glowing in red. "We're not just rescuing children," Thorne said. "We're dismantling the idea that anyone can touch them. We're going to spend the next 15 days making sure that every time a Thraxian looks at a human child, they don't see an asset. They see the end of their world." I looked at the bear on the console. I thought about Pete Callow and his reckless laugh. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice finally steady. "Let's get to work." The jump space between Aegis 9 and our next target was a tunnel of screaming light that lasted for exactly 4 hours and 12 minutes. On a normal patrol, that time would have been spent on maintenance cycles, catching up on sleep, or playing high-stakes cards in the mess hall. But the Vigilant wasn't on a normal patrol anymore. We were a ghost ship carrying 900 ghosts, and the weight of Pete Callow's death sat in the center of the bridge like a lead weight. I sat at my tactical console, my fingers trembling slightly as I recalibrated the ghost drive for our next egress. I kept looking at the empty spot on my sensor array where the Hawks Bridge used to be. Pete was gone. The man who had once tried to brew moonshine in the engine room and ended up blowing the secondary life support fuses was now nothing but stardust and memory. He had died laughing, or so I hoped. He had bought us the time we needed to save 900 futures, but the cost felt like a jagged blade in my gut. Vance, get a grip, I whispered to myself, wiping a smear of grease from the glass. You're skating on thin ice, and the Admiral doesn't like a shaky hand. Thorne was sitting in his command chair, as motionless as a statue. He hadn't eaten or slept since we left Kalyx-4. He was staring at a holographic map of the Thraxian hegemony, a sprawling web of 11 star systems that had dominated this sector for 3 centuries. Red icons flickered across the display, marking every Thraxian military outpost, every logistics hub, and every shipyard that had contributed to the Debt of Ages protocol. Admiral, we are approaching Kalyx-4, Ilara said from the comms station. Her voice was thin, brittle as scorched paper. She had been Pete's sister-in-law. She hadn't cried yet, but the way she hit the keys on her console told me she was 1 second away from shattering. Kalyx-4 was the primary manufacturing hub for Thraxian neural gas. It was a massive, rotating ring station orbiting a gas giant, protected by 3 capital-class cruisers and a swarming defensive grid. Status of the children? Thorne asked, ignoring the tactical threat. Medbay is over capacity, sir, I reported, pulling up the internal feed. Lucy Hayden and her team are still waking them up from stasis. Most of them are disoriented. Some are. They're in shock, Admiral. The neural gas has a nasty habit of leaving a mental residue. They remember the capture. They remember being stacked in those crates. Thorne stood up. He walked to the viewport, looking out into the swirling colors of jump space. We are 41 in the Council, Vance. Do you know why? Sir? Because the galaxy thinks we are a species of shopkeepers, Thorne said, his voice a low vibration. They think we measure our worth in credits and diplomatic favors. They think we are patient because we are afraid. They look at our 2 observer seats, and they see a species that has forgotten how to bite. He turned around, and the red emergency lights of the bridge caught the hard lines of his face. The Thraxians didn't just take children, Vance. They took the certainty of a tomorrow. If we go home now, we prove them right. We prove that the price of 900 human lives is 1 patrol vessel and a 3-month mediation session. He leaned over my console, pointing at the Kalyx-4 hub. This is the calculus of pain. For every hour those children spent in stasis, we take a year of Thraxian progress. For every tear shed on Oakhaven, we burn a mile of their infrastructure. We are not here for revenge. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is messy. We are here for arithmetic. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's cooling system. The Admiral wasn't just talking about a battle. He was talking about a systematic erasure. Exiting jump in 30 seconds, I announced. The Vigilant groaned as we tore back into real space. Kalyx-4 loomed ahead of us, a glittering crown of steel and light encircling the purple clouds of the gas giant. The 3 Thraxian cruisers were already moving to intercept, their massive ion cannons glowing with a pre-fire hum. They're hot-mic'd, and weapons hot, Admiral, Ilara shouted. They were expecting us. Of course they were, Thorne said, They think we're here to die for the sake of a grand gesture. Vance, deploy the Widowmakers. The Widowmakers were the dirty secret of Earth's experimental weapons division. They were automated, sublight drones equipped with localized fusion cores. They didn't fire lasers. They didn't drop bombs. They were the bombs. They were designed to ghost walk through shields using the same graviton warping tech as our ghost drives and detonate directly against the hull. 36 Widowmakers streaked from our launch tubes. On the sensor screen, they looked like tiny needles of light. The Thraxian cruisers opened fire, a wall of ion energy that turned the void into a kaleidoscope of death. But the Widowmakers were too small, too fast, and they weren't following the standard flight paths their computers were programmed to predict. One cruiser, the Pride of Thrax, tried to bring its primary shields to full power, but it was too late. 4 Widowmakers slammed into its aft engine block. The resulting explosion was a silent, blinding blossom of white fire. The cruiser's stern disintegrated, its massive reactors going critical in a chain reaction that tore the ship in half. 2 to go, I muttered, my heart racing. The second cruiser was smarter. It launched a swarm of interceptors to screen the drones. The space around FiLogs-4 became a chaotic mess of tracers and flak. But while the Thraxians were busy swatting at the drones, we weren't just sitting there. Ilara, open a channel to the station commander, Thorne ordered. A moment later, the screen flickered to life. A Thraxian officer appeared, a high-caste noble with a crest of silver-tipped mandibles. He looked more annoyed than afraid. "Human," the Thraxian clicked. "You have destroyed a sovereign vessel. Your extinction is now a matter of public record. Power down or be pulverized." "Commander," Thorne said, his voice flat, "I am not here to negotiate your survival. I am giving you 2 minutes to evacuate your non-military personnel to the escape pods. After that, FiLogs-4 ceases to exist." The Thraxian let out a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. This station produces 60% of the medical gases for this sector. You would condemn millions to suffer for the sake of 900 whelps? Thorne leaned into the camera. "Those whelps are my species' heart. You touched the heart, Commander. Now I'm taking the lungs. 1 minute and 40 seconds remaining." He cut the signal. "Admiral, are we really going to slag a medical hub?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. "There are thousands of workers on that station. Most of them probably don't even know what happened on Kalyx-4. Thorne didn't look at me. He looked at the timer on the screen. "The responsibility for their lives belongs to the government that decided our children were collateral, Vance. If we make exceptions, we make weaknesses. We are teaching the galaxy that there is no acceptable level of aggression against humanity." I looked at Ilara. She was staring at the station, her fingers hovering over the fire control lock. I could see the struggle in her eyes, the raw grief for Pete fighting against the horror of what we were about to do. We were the good guys. We were the peaceful observers. That was the story we told ourselves for 30 years. But as the timer hit 0, I realized that the story was a lie. We weren't the good guys. We were just the ones who had been pushed too far. "Time's up," Thorne said. "Vance, fire the phase missiles. Aim for the station's structural struts." I wanted to fold like a house of cards. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to. I hit the sequence. 6 phase missiles, each carrying a payload of concentrated graviton energy, streaked toward FiLogs-4. They bypassed the station's defensive grid, phasing through the outer armor before detonating deep within the structural marrow of the ring. The sound of the station tearing apart was transmitted through the hull vibrations of the Vigilant. It was a low, grinding moan that felt like it was coming from the ship's own soul. The massive ring buckled, the centrifugal force of its rotation tearing the damaged sections away. Atmosphere vented in great white plumes, carrying debris and bodies into the cold dark. The remaining Thraxian cruisers were in a frenzy now, but our ghost mirror was back online, creating 100 false targets for them to chase. We were a phantom in the wreckage, a predator in the smoke. "Mission accomplished, Admiral," I said, though the words felt like salt in a wound. "The station is neutralized. Manufacturing capability is flat-lined." Thorne sat back in his chair. He looked at the lopsided bear on the console. "Set coordinates for the Thrax-Narath transit relay," he said. "We're moving to the next link in the chain." "But, sir," Ilara whispered, "the children, they're starting to wake up. They're scared. Lucy says they need to go home." "We go home when the lesson is finished," Thorne said. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at any of us. He just stared into the void, a man who had decided that the only way to save the future was to burn the bridge back to the past. I turned back to my console, the red lights reflecting in my eyes. I thought about the 3 bowls of oatmeal on the table in Oakhaven. I thought about the empty chairs in the schoolhouse. And then I thought about the thousands of Thraxian workers currently drifting in the gas giant's orbit. The calculus was simple. The math was perfect. But as we jumped back into the screaming light of the fold, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever be able to count high enough to pay for what we were becoming. The medbay of the Vigilant was never designed for this. It was a sterile, efficient space meant for patching up tactical officers with plasma burns or treating engineers who'd breathed in too much coolant leak. Now, it was a sea of small, shivering bodies wrapped in silver thermal blankets. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the low, rhythmic humming of the stasis recovery units. I had been sent down by the Admiral to deliver a status report to Lucy Hayden, but when I stepped through the pressurized doors, I stopped dead. 900 children. It's one thing to see the number on a tactical screen, it's another to see the reality. They were everywhere, huddled in the corners, sitting on the examination tables, sleeping in makeshift bunks on the floor. The older ones were holding the younger ones, their eyes wide and glassy with the 1,000-yard stare you usually only see in veterans of the Rim Wars. "Vance!" Lucy called out. She was kneeling on the floor, holding a cup of nutrient broth for a small girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Lucy's uniform was stained with sweat and stasis fluid, and her eyes were rimmed with red. She looked like she'd gone 10 rounds with a Vulturian bruiser. "Status, Lucy?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Physically. They're stable," she said, standing up and wiping her hands on a cloth. "The Thraxians didn't starve them. They kept them in high-quality stasis. But the neural gas? Vance, it's like they were conscious for part of it. They have these fragments of memory, being moved like boxes, the sound of the Thraxian mandibles clicking. It's a nightmare." She looked around the room, her expression softening into something raw and painful. "They keep asking when the scary men are coming back. Some of them haven't spoken a word since we pulled them out of the crates." The little girl Lucy had been tending to, a child with tangled blonde hair and a dirt-smudged face, looked up at me. "Are you a scary man?" she whispered. I felt like someone had punched me in the throat. "No, honey," I said, kneeling down so I was at her eye level. "I'm Kaylin. I'm a friend of Pete's. Do you remember Pete? He was the one who flew the fast ship." The girl shook her head slowly. "I remember the smoke. And the boxes. I didn't like the boxes." I looked at Lucy. "Her name is Cora," Lucy whispered. "She's the one from the extraction report. 14 months old when she was taken. She's been the loudest one in the room until 10 minutes ago." Lucy stepped away from the girl, pulling me toward the far corner of the med bay, where the sound of the engines was muffled. "Vance, I heard what happened at FiLogs. The crew is talking. They say the Admiral slagged a medical hub. He neutralized a military manufacturing target," I corrected, though even to my own ears, the words sounded hollow. "It was part of the plan, Lucy. We have to show them that there's a cost." "A cost?" Lucy hissed, her voice a sharp blade. "Look at these kids, Kaylin. They don't need a lesson. They need a home. They need their parents. We have 900 traumatized children on a ship that is currently hunting the most dangerous fleet in the galaxy. This isn't a rescue anymore. It's a crusade." "Thorne knows what he's doing," I said, though my conviction was fading. "He's thinking about the next generation. He's thinking about the children on the next colony who won't get taken because the Thraxians are too scared to try it again." "And what about this generation?" Lucy pointed to the room. "What happens to Cora when she grows up knowing her life was bought with the deaths of 10,000 factory workers? What kind of future are we building if it's paved with that much blood?" I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't have an answer for myself. I just reached into my pocket and felt the shape of the lopsided bear. I had forgotten to leave it with the Admiral. "Tell the Admiral we need more supplies," Lucy said, her tone returning to a professional chill. "We're running low on sedatives and nutrient packs. And tell him that if he jumps us into another firefight, I'm locking the medbay doors. I won't have these kids terrified any more than they already are." I nodded and turned to leave, but Cora's voice stopped me again. "Kaylin?" I looked back. "Is Pete coming back?" she asked. "He said he'd show me the stars." I stood there for a long moment, the silence of the medbay pressing in on me like the weight of a planet. "No, Cora," I said, my voice cracking. "Pete, he had to stay behind to make sure the stars stayed bright for you." I hurried out of the medbay before she could ask anything else. When I got back to the bridge, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial adrenaline of the victory at FiLogs had worn off, replaced by a grim, heavy exhaustion. The crew was moving like ghosts, their eyes fixed on their consoles. "Admiral, we have an incoming transmission on the sovereignty frequency," Ilara said. "It's not the Council. It's the Thraxian High Regent." Thorne straightened in his chair. "Put him through." The screen flickered to life. The High Regent was older than the ambassador, his exoskeleton dull and pitted with age. He sat on a throne of black glass, his eyes like two dark pits of obsidian. He didn't look angry. He looked weary. "Commander Thorne," the Regent clicked. The translation software struggled with the ancient formal dialect. "You have caused much damage. The FiLogs hub was a centerpiece of our civilization. Thousands of lives have been extinguished." Thorne didn't blink. "Then we are even for the thousands of minutes of terror you inflicted on my people, Regent." The Regent leaned forward, his mandibles twitching. "You believe this is a game of balance? You believe that by burning our stations, you can change the nature of the galaxy? We are the Thraxian hegemony. We were traveling the stars when your ancestors were still sharpening sticks. The debt of ages is not a whim. It is the foundation of our order. Without tribute, there is no stability. The foundation of your order is built on the theft of children," Thorne said. "If that is your stability, then your order deserves to fall." The Regent let out a long, wheezing hiss. "We have returned the children, human. They are on your ship. The debt is settled. Why do you continue this madness?" "Because you haven't learned the lesson yet," Thorne said. "You think you can return what you stole, and everything goes back to the way it was. You think you can pay a fine and keep your soul, I am here to tell you that the price of human life is not negotiable." He leaned into the screen, his face a mask of cold fury. "I am going to dismantle every logistics chain, every fuel depot, and every command center that touched Kalyx-4. I am going to make the name humanity a word that causes your soldiers to wake up in a cold sweat. And when I am done, you will never, never look at another species and see property." The regent was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice a low, ominous rumble. "You are a small species, Thorne. You have 14 ships. We have thousands. You may win these small skirmishes, but you cannot win a war of attrition. You are burning your own future to spite us." Thorne smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "We aren't fighting a war of attrition, Regent. We're fighting a war of principle, and humans have a very long history of burning everything we own just to prove a point." He cut the signal. "Vance, set coordinates for the Alaris fuel depot," Thorne commanded. "Sir," I said, standing my ground, "Lucy says the children are struggling. We're low on supplies. We need to get back to Earth space. The Council is already scrambling a peacekeeping fleet to intercept us." Thorne turned his chair toward me. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a tremor in his hand that he couldn't quite hide. "Vance, do you know what happens if we stop now?" I don't know, sir. The Council will issue a formal apology. They will give us a permanent seat. They will give us a few credits for the inconvenience. And in 10 years, the Thraxians will find another loophole. They'll take children from a Vulturian colony, or a deep-dweller outpost, and everyone will look at us and say, "At least it wasn't the humans." He stood up and walked over to me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We are not just protecting our own, Vance. We are breaking the wheel. If we have to be the monsters to make the galaxy a safer place for Cora and the rest of them, then that is the burden we carry." He looked at the lopsided bear sitting on my console. He picked it up, his rough fingers tracing the missing eye. "Responsibility isn't about doing what's easy, Vance. It's about doing what is necessary so that they never have to know what necessary feels like." I looked at the Admiral, and for the first time, I didn't see a hero. I saw a man who was drowning in a sea of blood, trying to keep 900 heads above the water. I thought about Pete, and I thought about the thousands of dead Thraxians, and I thought about the little girl who remembered the boxes. The calculus was getting more complicated. The cost was rising. But as I entered the coordinates for the Alaris depot, I realized that Thorne was right about one thing. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time in 30 years, they weren't laughing at the clever little apes. They were terrified. "Jump," I said, and the stars shattered once again. We were 5 days into the 15-day campaign. The Thraxian hegemony was bleeding, and the sovereignty was in a panic. We were the rogue variable, the ghost in the machine, the nightmare that wouldn't end. But as the Vigilant dove into the fold, I couldn't help but look at the med bay monitor on my secondary screen. Cora was sitting on a bed, staring at the ceiling. She looked so small, so fragile, in the middle of our great, terrible war. We were saving her future. But I wondered, as the ship groaned around us, what kind of world would be left for her to live in when we were finally done. The jump into the Alaris system was the roughest yet. The ghost drive was beginning to scream under the strain of repeated, non-standard folds. The hull of the Vigilant groaned, a deep structural protest that vibrated through the soles of my boots. We had been running on tactical adrenaline for 9 days, and the toll was etched into every face on the bridge. Ilara had dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. Thorne was a shadow of a man, his presence defined only by the terrifying stillness of his posture. "Admiral, the ghost drive is shedding heat at a dangerous rate," I reported, my hands hovering over the diagnostic monitors. "We've pushed the graviton coils past their safety thresholds. If we jump again without a 24-hour cooling cycle, we risk a total core collapse." Thorne didn't even look up from his tactical display. "We don't have 24 hours, Vance. The Sovereignty's peacekeeping fleet is 4 light-years behind us. They aren't coming to talk about the weather. They're coming to put the leash back on the dog." He was right. The 40 species of the Council were terrified, not of the Thraxians, but of us. They had built a galaxy based on the idea that every problem had a bureaucratic solution, that every tragedy could be smoothed over with a trade agreement or a formal apology. We had shattered that illusion. We had shown them that when you take the future from a human, the human stops caring about the present. The Olaris fuel depot loomed on our sensors, a sprawling complex of interconnected spheres and docking pylons orbiting a sapphire-blue star. It was the primary refueling station for the Thraxian Fourth Fleet. Without it, their border patrols would be stranded, and their logistics chain would snap like dry parchment. "It's too quiet," Ilara whispered, her fingers dancing over the comms board. "They know we're here. They've gone dark." "Standard Thraxian spider trap," I said, shifting the ghost mirror to wide-angle coverage. "They want us to commit to the approach before they spring the net." Thorne stood up and walked to the viewport. The blue star cast a haunting light across his features, making him look like an ancient deity of war. "This is the heart of their mobility, Vance. If Olaris falls, they can't chase us. They can't follow the children home. The children." The word always changed the air on the bridge. Every time we spoke of them, the tactical coldness of the room thawed just enough to let the pain in. 900 children were still huddled in the med bay, listening to the muffled thumps of our cannons and the screeching of the hull. They were the reason we were here, but they were also the weight that was dragging us down. Lucy Hayden's voice crackled through the internal comms. "Admiral, I have a situation down here." "Report," Thorne barked. "It's Cora," Lucy said, her voice strained. "She's found her way into the ventilation shafts. She keeps trying to get to the bridge. She says she needs to tell the big man something." Thorne's jaw tightened. "Keep her in the med bay, Lucy. We're about to enter a high kinetic engagement. I don't have time for hide and seek." "Admiral, she's persistent," Lucy countered. "She's a smart kid. She knows where the bridge is. Just keep an eye on your sensors." Thorne cut the channel with a sharp flick of his wrist. "Sensors. Focus on the depot. Vance, prepare the phase missiles." The Thraxian trap sprung exactly 4 seconds later. 6 cloaked destroyers materialized from the shadow of the fuel spheres, their ion cannons already glowing with lethal intent. It was a classic pincer maneuver. They didn't want to destroy us yet. They wanted to disable our engines and board us. They wanted their property back. "They're hot-mic'd," Ilara shouted. "Incoming pulse fire!" The Vigilant bucked as the first volley slammed into our forward shields. The lights on the bridge flickered, and the smell of ozone filled the air. "Return fire," Thorne commanded. "Target the lead destroyer's fuel lines." I didn't need to be told twice. I locked the phase missiles and let them fly. The space between us and the Thraxian fleet became a chaotic web of white-hot tracers and blue ion beams. We were outnumbered 6-1, but we were faster. The ghost mirror was working overtime, creating dozens of phantom vigilants that danced around the Thraxian targeting computers. One destroyer went up in a brilliant orange blossom of fire as my missiles found its primary fuel shunts. The shockwave rattled our teeth, but I didn't stop. I shifted fire to the second target, my fingers moving with a precision that felt detached from my own mind. We were winning. We were the better pilots, the better tacticians. We had the better tech, built in secret while the rest of the galaxy slept. But then, the sensor board let out a high-pitched rhythmic chime. "Admiral! Multiple jump signatures!" Ilara cried. "They're huge! Capital class." I looked at the display. My heart sank. It wasn't the Thraxians. The energy signatures were different, cleaner, more refined. It was the Sovereignty peacekeeping fleet, led by the Vulturians and the Deep Dwellers. The 40 species had arrived to stop the 41st. A massive silver-hulled dreadnought, the Star of Accord, exited the fold directly between us and the fuel depot. It was 10 times the size of the Vigilant, a floating city of diplomatic power and overwhelming force. Human vessel Vigilant. A booming, translated voice filled the bridge. "This is High Commander Srelt, of the Sovereignty Peacekeeping Force. You are in violation of the Galactic Peace Treaty and the Article of Non-Aggression. Power down your weapons and surrender your command. Any further hostile action will be met with terminal force." The Thraxian destroyers immediately pulled back, hiding behind the massive bulk of the Sovereignty dreadnought like cowards behind a wall. Thorne didn't flinch. He walked to the comms station and leaned over Ilara. "Commander Srelt," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "you are standing in the way of a rescue operation. The Thraxian hegemony has kidnapped 900 human citizens. Where was your peacekeeping force when the distress signal went out from Kalyx-4? The Thraxian action is a matter for the subcommittee on territorial disputes," Srelt replied, the tone cold and dismissive. "Your response, however, is an act of total war. You have destroyed civilian hubs and military installations. You have destabilized the entire Viridian Fringe. You will stand down, Admiral Thorne. This is your only warning." Thorne looked at me. Then he looked at the tactical map. The fuel depot was right there. If we took it out, we could jump away before the dreadnought could cycle its primary weapons. But doing so would mean firing through a sovereignty vessel. It would mean the end of any hope for a diplomatic future. I felt a small tug on my sleeve. I looked down, my breath catching in my chest. It was Cora. She was covered in gray dust from the ventilation shafts, her blonde hair tangled and messy. She was holding the lopsided bear I had left on the console. "How did you—" I started to whisper. She didn't look at me. She was looking at Thorne, the big man. "Why is the sky crying?" she asked, her voice small and clear in the silence of the bridge. "The sky isn't crying, Cora," Thorne said, his voice softening in a way that made my chest ache. He didn't turn around. He stayed focused on the viewport. "It looks like it's crying," she said, pointing to the streaks of ion fire and the burning wreckage of the Thraxian destroyer. "It looks like it's sad. My mommy says, when the sky is sad, we have to be quiet and wait for the sun." Thorne finally turned. He looked at the little girl, a dusty, fragile scrap of humanity standing in the center of his war room. In that moment, the calculus of pain seemed to falter. The math was perfect, but the variables were changing. "Cora, go back to Lucy," Thorne said, his voice cracking just the slightest bit. "Is the sun coming back?" she asked, her eyes wide and searching. Thorne looked at the Sovereignty dreadnought, the silver wall that stood between us, and the justice he had spent 10 days carving out of the void. He looked at the 40 species who were willing to let 900 children rot in stasis for the sake of a stable galaxy. "Yes, Cora," Thorne said, his jaw setting into a new, harder line. "The sun is coming back. I'm going to make sure of it. He looked at me. Vance, ignore the dreadnought. Focus all remaining phase missiles on the central fuel pylon of the depot. Sir? I asked, my heart hammering. If we fire now, we're declaring war on the entire sovereignty. We'll be hunted by every species in the galaxy. Thorne stepped toward me, his hand resting on my shoulder. Vance, look at her. I looked at Cora. She was hugging the bear, waiting for an answer. We spent 30 years being the quiet species, Vance. We spent 30 years following their rules, filing their forms, and watching them look through us like we were made of glass. And the moment we needed them, they told us to wait for a subcommittee. He pointed to the dreadnought. They aren't here to protect the children. They're here to protect the status quo. If we stand down now, we tell the galaxy that the status quo is more important than Cora's life. I will not have that be the lesson. He turned back to the viewport. Commander Sorrelt, you have 60 seconds to move your vessel. After that, I am firing on the depot. If you are in the way, that is a choice you are making on behalf of your council. The bridge of the Vigilant went deathly silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. I watched the timer on my screen. 50 seconds. 40. The Sovereignty dreadnought didn't move. It was a monument to arrogance, convinced that the little apes would never dare to pull the trigger. 30 seconds. Cora reached out and took Thorne's hand. Her small, dusty fingers curled around his weathered palm. He didn't pull away. 20 seconds. Vance, lock targets, Thorne said. Targets locked, I whispered. My finger hovered over the firing stud. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the entire history of the human race balanced on the tip of my finger. 10 seconds. Admiral, the Vulturians are charging their primary beams, Ilara shouted. They're going to slag us. Let them try, Thorne said. 5, 4, 3, 2, fire. The Vigilant shivered as the last of our phase missiles left the tubes. They didn't head for the dreadnought. They dove under its belly, weaving through the gravitational wake of the massive ship, and slammed into the central pylon of the Olaris fuel depot. The explosion was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't a blossom. It was a sun. 5 million tons of refined Thraxian fuel ignited in a single microsecond. The shockwave was so powerful it physically pushed the Sovereignty dreadnought off its axis. The fuel spheres began to chain react, tearing the station apart in a series of blinding white pulses. The sky wasn't crying anymore. It was burning. The Thraxian destroyers were vaporized instantly. The Sovereignty dreadnought's shields flared a violent purple as it struggled to handle the thermal output of the dying station. Jump! Thorne roared. I hit the ghost drive. The graviton coils screamed, a sound like 1,000 banshees, as we tore a hole in the fabric of space. The Vigilant vanished from the Olaris system just as the Vulturian primary beams sliced through the space where we had been sitting. We were in the fold. It was quiet. The red emergency lights were the only thing illuminating the bridge. Thorne was still holding Cora's hand. He looked down at her, and for the first time in the entire campaign, I saw a tear track through the dust on his cheek. See, Cora, he whispered. I told you the sun was coming back. She looked at the viewport, where the shifting colors of jump space were the only thing visible. Is that the sun? It's the start of it, Thorne said. He looked at me, and I saw the transformation. He wasn't the admiral of the calculus of pain anymore. He was a man who had just burned the bridge to the world he knew, to build a world that Cora could actually live in. Where to now, sir? I asked, my voice steady for the first time in days. Thorne straightened his jacket. He looked at the lopsided bear. To the Thraxian home system, Vance. We have one more lesson to teach, and this time we're going to make sure the entire galaxy is in the front row. The Thraxian home system, Thrax Prime, was a fortress of 1,000 suns. Or at least, that's what the intelligence files said. It was the center of an empire that had never known a real challenge, protected by an orbital ring that housed 3 million soldiers and a fleet that could darken the stars. We exited the fold at the very edge of the system, the Vigilant limping, its hull scarred and its ghost drive barely holding together with magnetic tape and prayers. We were alone. The 14 ships of our patrol had been scattered or destroyed at Oakhaven and Oaris. It was just us, 900 children, and a captain who had decided that the math was no longer enough. "Status, Vance," Thorne said. He was sitting in his chair, Cora still sitting on the floor beside him, playing with the bear. She seemed calmer now, as if the fire at Alaris had finally burned away the terror of the boxes. "Engines at 40%, sir," I said. "Shields are flickering. We have exactly 3 phase missiles left. The ghost mirror is fried. If they see us, we're done." "Then we make sure they see exactly what we want them to see," Thorne said. "Elara, open a wideband transmission. Use the emergency diplomatic frequency. I want every screen on Thrax Prime to show my face." Elara didn't hesitate. She was past the point of questioning orders. She was a ghost of herself, a woman who had lost her family and found a new one in the silence of this bridge. "Transmission live, Admiral. You're on every screen in the system." Thorne leaned forward. He didn't look like a conqueror. He looked like a father who had reached the end of his patience. "People of the Thraxian hegemony," he said, his voice echoing through the bridge and across the light years to the heart of their empire. "My name is Admiral Alaric Thorne. I am the man who burned Valon 4. I am the man who destroyed the Olaris Depot. I am the man who fired through a sovereignty dreadnought to reach your logistics chain." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You call us the 41st species. You call us the clever little apes. You thought you could take our children and pay us in grain and apologies. You thought our silence was a sign of weakness." He reached down and picked up Cora. He held her up to the camera, her dusty face and wide eyes visible to billions of Thraxians. "This is Cora," he said. "She is 4 years old. She likes stories about stars. She was one of the 900 you put in stasis crates. She is not property. She is not an asset. She is the reason I am going to do what I am about to do." "Admiral, the Thraxian home fleet is moving," Elara shouted. 200 signatures. They're launching everything." Thorne didn't blink. "I am currently sitting on a vessel that carries a localized Sungate detonator," he lied. His voice was so steady, so certain, that even I almost believed him. "If I trigger this device, the jump gate orbiting Thrax Prime will collapse into a singularity. It will tear your orbital ring apart. It will freeze your world in a 1,000-year winter." The bridge went cold. We didn't have a Sungate detonator. We had 3 phase missiles and a broken engine. But Thorne was playing the ultimate game of poker with the lives of billions on the line. "Thraxian High Regent, you have 10 minutes, Thorne continued. "You will broadcast a formal dissolution of the Debt of Ages. You will provide a permanent, unescorted corridor for all human vessels. And you will acknowledge, in front of the entire sovereignty, that a human child is a sacred and untouchable entity." "If you do not," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a death knell, "I will trigger the gate, and the silence of the 41st species will become the silence of the Thraxian race." He cut the channel. "Admiral," I whispered, my hands shaking, "we don't have a detonator. If they call our bluff, we're dead." They'll slag us before we can even turn around." "I know," Thorne said. He set Cora down. "Then why?" I asked. "Why push it this far?" "The children are safe. We could have slipped away." "Because the children aren't safe yet, Vance," Thorne said, walking to the viewport. "They'll never be safe as long as the galaxy thinks we're bluffing. They'll never be safe as long as the Council thinks they can manage our outbursts." He looked at the swarm of Thraxian ships approaching us on the sensors. Hundreds of points of light, each one a harbinger of our destruction. "The lesson isn't about how much we can burn, Vance. It's about how much we're willing to lose to protect what matters. I'm willing to lose everything. Are you?" I looked at Alara. She nodded, a single, sharp movement. I looked at the medbay monitor, where 900 children were waiting for a tomorrow they didn't yet understand. "Yes, sir," I said. "I'm in." The minutes ticked by. 9 minutes. 8. 7. The Thraxian fleet didn't stop. They were closing the distance, their long-range scanners trying to verify the existence of the detonator. Our ghost drive was hummed a low, dying note, the graviton coils beginning to glow with a sickly orange light. 6 minutes. 5. "Admiral, the Sovereignty peacekeeping fleet has entered the system," Ilara reported. "They're behind us. They're locking on. We were caught between the hammer and the anvil, the Thraxians in front, the Council behind. 14 ships had become one. The 41st species was about to be erased from the map. 4 minutes. Cora walked over to the viewport. She stood next to Thorne, her small hand pressing against the cold glass. "The stars are very bright today," she said. "They are, Cora," Thorne said. "Are they bright because they're happy?" Thorne looked at the approaching Thraxian fleet. "I think they're bright because they're watching us, Cora. They want to see what we do." 3 minutes. "Admiral, the Thraxian High Regent is hailing us," Ilara said, her voice trembling. Thorne didn't rush to the screen. He took a long, slow breath. "Put him through." The High Regent's face appeared. He looked different than before. The weariness was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. He had seen the destruction of Alaris. He had seen the calculus in action. And he looked at Cora, standing next to the man who was ready to freeze his world. "Admiral Thorne," the Regent clicked, the sound jagged and desperate. "The debt of ages is hereby dissolved. The territorial corridors are open. We acknowledge your terms." There was a collective exhale on the bridge. Alara slumped into her chair. I felt the strength leave my legs. "And the statement?" Thorne asked, his voice showing no relief. "The public acknowledgement? It is being broadcast now," the Regent said, "to the entire sovereignty, to every system in the Accord." Thorne watched the secondary monitor. The Regent's voice filled the galaxy, admitting the error of the Thraxian hegemony, admitting that humanity was not property, admitting that they were afraid. But Thorne didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just looked at the Regent. "Good," he said. "Now, move your fleet. We're going home." The Thraxian ships peeled away, a massive wave of steel retreating from a single broken frigate. The Sovereignty fleet stayed back, their sensors fixed on us, their commanders surely debating how to handle the rogue Apes who had just brought an empire to its knees. We began the jump sequence. The ghost drive groaned one last time, the coils glowing white-hot before the fold finally took us. The transition was silent. For the first time in 15 days, the bridge was quiet, without the sound of weapons or the smell of ozone. Thorne sat in his chair and picked up the lopsided bear. He held it for a long moment, then he handed it back to Cora. "Go to Lucy, Cora," he said. "Tell her the sun is all the way back now." She beamed at him. a bright, pure smile that seemed to illuminate the entire bridge. She hugged the bear and ran toward the lift. When she was gone, Thorne looked at me. His eyes were hollow, the fire of the campaign finally burning out. "We did it, sir," I said. "We saved them. All of them." "We saved their lives, Vance," Thorne said, his voice a dry rasp. "But we changed their world. And we changed ourselves." He looked at the empty tactical display. "We spent 30 years trying to be the civilized species. We wanted to be part of their beautiful, orderly galaxy. But the only way to save those kids was to show the galaxy that we are the only species that will burn the house down to save the family." He stood up, his movements heavy and slow. "That's the lesson, Vance. Not just for the Thraxians, for us. We now have the seat we wanted. But the cost was the peace we used to have. The galaxy will never look at those two observer chairs the same way again. They'll look at them and see a predator that's just waiting for a reason to wake up." I looked at the stars passing by outside the viewport. He was right. We were going home as heroes, but we were also going home as the monsters that everyone else was now afraid of. The humanistic theme I had struggled with for 10 days finally hit me with the force of a phase missile. We don't protect children because it's the legal thing to do, or the diplomatic thing to do. We protect them because they are the only part of us that isn't broken yet. And to keep them that way, we have to be willing to break ourselves. "Admiral?" I asked, as he walked toward the lift. "Yes, Vance." "Was there really a detonator?" Thorne stopped. He didn't turn around. "Vance," he said, "I'm a human. If I had to, I would have used the ghost drive core. It would have done the same thing." The lift doors hissed shut. I sat back in my chair and looked at the console. The lopsided bear was gone, but the dust of Kalyx-4 was still on my boots. We were the 41st species. We were the youngest, the smallest, and the last admitted. But as the Vigilant limped toward Earth, I knew one thing for certain. Nobody was ever going to call us clever little apes, ever again. The return to the solar system was not the triumphal procession the history vids usually depict. There were no streamers of light, no jubilant broadcasts, and certainly no victory parades waiting in the high-gravity docks of Lunar Command. Instead, we drifted past the orbital buoy of Jupiter at 2300 hours ship time, a charred skeletal shadow of a frigate trailing a wake of cooling ion gas. The Vigilant was holding together by little more than the stubbornness of its crew, and the sheer refusal of Admiral Thorne to let it die before the 900 souls in the med bay were back on solid ground. I stood at my tactical station, my hands resting on a console that was now mostly dead glass and exposed wiring. My fingers were stained with a mixture of carbon scoring and hydraulic fluid. We were being escorted, if you could call it that, by 6 sovereignty dreadnoughts. They didn't fly in formation with us. They hemmed us in, their primary weapons tracking our every micro-adjustment. They were terrified that the rogue apes might decide to pull one last trick out of their sleeve before the curtain fell. "Admiral, we are crossing the Martian threshold," Ilara said. Her voice was a ghostly rasp, the product of 48 hours without sleep and a diet of caffeine pills and recycled air. She looked at the display, where the red planet glowed like a dying ember. "Earth Command is requesting a full systems lock and a remote pilot handshake. They want to fly us in." Thorne didn't turn around. He was looking at the small, lopsided bear that sat on the edge of the viewport ledge. Cora had left it there before Lucy moved her to the final transit shuttle. "Tell them they can have the handshake when the last child is off this ship," he said. "Until then, I'm holding the stick." "Sir, they're threatening to cut our power feed from the orbital ring if we don't comply," Ilara added, her eyes flickering toward the sovereignty blips on the sensor screen. The Vulturian commander is getting jumpy. He's hot-mic'd on the general frequency, calling us a clear and present danger to the peace." "The peace," Thorne spat, the word sounding like a curse. "He means the quiet. There's a difference, Ilara. One is earned, the other is just a lack of noise." I watched the tactical feed as we approached the Earth-Moon Lagrange point. Thousands of civilian ships were scattered across the sector, kept back by a massive military cordon. These were the families, the parents of Oakhaven, who had been off-world during the raid, the relatives from the other fringe colonies, and the millions of people who had watched the 15-day campaign through grainy, unofficial feeds. They weren't cheering. They were waiting in a silence that felt heavier than the vacuum outside. "Vance," Thorne said softly. "Sir? What do the numbers say now?" I looked at my screen, scrolling through the damage reports and the resource logs. "We lost 14 ships, Admiral. 322 crew members are confirmed KIA. We burned through 12 years of secret research and 6 trillion credits worth of infrastructure. On the other side, the Thraxian hegemony has lost 3 logistics hubs, 2 manufacturing rings, and their entire 4th fleet is in a state of structural collapse." I paused, my throat dry. "And 900 children are currently breathing oxygen in our med bay. Not one lost, not one left behind." Thorne nodded. "That is the only math that matters. The rest is just accounting." As the Vigilant began its slow docking sequence with the Luna Gateway, the internal comms lit up. It was Lucy Hayden. She sounded like she had finally hit the wall, her voice trembling with a exhaustion that went deeper than bone. "Admiral, we're ready," she said. "The first group is at the airlock. Cora is with them. She wants to see you before she goes." Thorne closed his eyes for a 3-second count. It was the only sign of weakness I had seen in him since Oakhaven. "Tell her I'm busy, Lucy. Tell her I have to park the ship." "Sir," I whispered, "you should go. You're the reason she's here." "No, Vance," Thorne said, opening his eyes. They were hollow, haunted by the thousands of faces he had erased from the galaxy to save 900. "I am the reason she will never be the same. I am the man who showed her that the universe is a place where you have to burn worlds to stay safe. Let her go home to her grandmother. Let her forget my face. That's the last gift I can give her." The docking clamps engaged with a bone-jarring thud. The Vigilant groaned, its engines finally cycling down into a cooling hiss. The bridge lights shifted from the predatory red of combat to the sterile pale yellow of a space station's auxiliary power. It felt like the end of a long, terrible dream. For the next 6 hours, we watched the monitors in silence as the children were offloaded. It was a slow, methodical process. Medical teams in white hazmat suits entered the ship, carrying stretchers and guidance leads. We watched Cora walk down the ramp, clutching a new, clean blanket the medics had given her. She stopped at the end of the airlock, looking back at the scarred hull of our ship for a long minute. She didn't wave. She just stood there, a small, fragile point of light in a universe of gray steel, before she was led away into the terminal. When the last child was gone, the bridge door hissed open. It wasn't a medical team. It was a squad of Earth Navy Shore Patrol, their black uniforms crisp and their pulse rifles held at a low ready. Behind them stood Admiral Sira Akafer, the woman who had sent us into the fire. She looked older than she had 15 days ago, her silver hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun. "Admiral Thorne," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a funeral march, "you are relieved of command." Thorne stood up. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. He took his command chip from the console and handed it to her. "The ship is secure, Admiral. The cargo has been delivered." The cargo is currently being treated for severe psychological trauma, Alaric, Akafer said, her eyes flashing with a mix of respect and fury. And the Council is currently drafting an article of expulsion for the entire human race. You didn't just break the rules, you burned the rule book and used the ashes to blind the High Arbiter. The rules were written by the people who took the children, Thorne said calmly. I simply provided a translation they could understand. Akafer looked at me, then at Ilara. Captain Vance, Lieutenant Ilara, you are to be confined to your quarters, pending a full tribunal. You followed an unlawful order that led to the deaths of thousands of sovereignty citizens. We followed the only order that mattered, Ilara said, her voice sharp and defiant. We brought the kids home. If that makes us criminals, then I don't want to be a citizen of your galaxy anyway. Akafer didn't argue. She gestured to the guards. Take them. As I was led off the bridge, I looked back one last time. Thorne was standing by the viewport, his back to the guards. He was looking at the small, lopsided bear that Cora had left behind. In the sterile light of the station, the toy looked like a piece of junk, a forgotten scrap of fabric and fluff. But to us, it was the only thing in the entire system that felt real. The next 3 days were a blur of windowless rooms and endless questioning. I was interrogated by Vulturians, by deep dwellers, and by our own internal affairs officers. They wanted to know about the calculus of pain. They wanted to know if Thorne had gone mad. They wanted to know if there was a secret cabal of humans planning a coup against the sovereignty. I told them the truth, every single time. I told them about the empty chairs at Oakhaven. I told them about the stasis crates. I told them that we weren't a cabal. We were just a species that had finally run out of patience. On the 4th day, the cell door opened, and I was given a fresh uniform. Not my tactical black, but a formal blue diplomatic coat. The Council is ready for you, the guard said. I was taken to the High Sovereignty's secondary chamber on Earth, a massive, vaulted room carved into the side of the Swiss Alps. It was meant to be a place of neutral ground, but as I walked in, I could feel the hostility of the 40 species like a physical weight. Every seat was filled. Every translator was humming. In the center of the room, sitting in the 2 observer chairs, were Thorne and Sira Akafer. Thorne looked rested, his face clean-shaven and his uniform immaculate. He didn't look like a man facing a death sentence. He looked like a man who had already won. The High Arbiter, the crystalline echo of ages, vibrated with a sharp, discordant tone. The matter of the 41st species is now in session. We have heard the testimony of the Thraxian survivors. We have reviewed the logs of the Olaris destruction. The Council finds the actions of the human fleet to be disproportionate, barbaric, and a threat to the fundamental stability of the Accord. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The Thraxian representative, a new one with a nervous twitch in his mandibles, nodded vigorously. However, the Arbiter continued, the crystals shifting to a deep, resonant purple. We have also reviewed the records of the Oakhaven abduction. We have found that the Thraxian hegemony acted in bad faith, utilizing a legal loophole that the Council has now formally abolished. Therefore, in the interest of preventing a total galactic war, a compromise has been proposed. I held my breath. Humanity will be granted full permanent membership in the High Sovereignty, the Arbiter announced. A seat on the High Council will be established for the United Earth Expeditionary Command. In exchange, Admiral Alaric Thorne will be stripped of all rank and banished from sovereignty space for the remainder of his biological life. The human fleet will be dismantled and integrated into the peacekeeping force. It was a bribe, a golden cage. They were giving us the seat we had wanted for 30 years, but they were doing it to keep us close, to watch us, and to make sure we never became unpredictable again. Akafor stood up to accept the terms, her face a mask of professional gratitude. But Thorne stayed seated. He looked at the council, at the 40 species who thought they were finally managing the problem. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence he had cultivated for 30 years was back. But this time, it was a silence that made the High Arbiter flicker with unease. I looked at Thorne, and I realized then that he had expected this. He had known from the moment he jumped to Aegis 9 that he was the sacrificial lamb. He had burned his own life to buy a seat for a species that would now be feared for the next 1,000 years. The session was adjourned, and as the delegates began to file out, Thorne caught my eye. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the nod of a teacher who had just finished his final lecture. And as I walked out into the cold mountain air, I realized that the calculus of pain wasn't over. It was just moving into a new phase. We had the seat. We had the power. But as I looked at the snow-capped peaks, I wondered if we had lost the very thing that made us human in the process. 1 year later, the world was a different place, though the mountains remained as indifferent as ever. I was no longer Captain Vance of the Vigilant. I was Ambassador Vance, the man who occupied the second chair in the High Sovereignty's Obsidian Cathedral. I wore the blue coat now, the one that felt like a straitjacket, and I spent my days filing reports that people actually read. Our permanent council seat was situated between the Volturians and the Deep Dwellers, a position of prestige that came with a constant, simmering undercurrent of dread from our neighbors. Humanity was no longer number 41. We were the enforcers. Every time a territorial dispute flared up or a resource quota wasn't met, the delegates would look at us with wide, nervous eyes, waiting to see if we were going to reach for our phase missiles or our diplomatic pens. We were respected, yes, but it was the respect a hiker gives to a sleeping bear. Thorne was gone, of course. His banishment had been absolute. Rumor had it he was living on a rogue station in the Perseus Arm, outside the reach of the Sovereignty's long-range sensors, but no one really knew. He had become a ghost, a myth we used to frighten the Thraxians whenever they got too close to our borders. I was sitting in the council gardens during a recess, watching the alien flora pulse with artificial light, when I saw a familiar face. It was Lucy Hayden. She wasn't in uniform. She was wearing civilian clothes, a simple brown jacket and trousers. She looked younger, the stress of the campaign finally smoothed out of her features. "Lucy," I said, standing up, "what are you doing here on the station?" "I'm on my way to Kalyx-4, she said, giving me a small, tired smile. "The Oakhaven colony is being rebuilt. Most of the families are going back. They wanted some of the original extraction team to be there for the dedication of the new schoolhouse." "Is she going?" I asked, knowing exactly who I meant. "Cora?" Lucy nodded. "She's 6 now. She still has the bear, Kaylin. She calls it Pete. She's doing well. She's smart, top of her class in math. But she doesn't like being in small rooms, and she hates the sound of clicking." I looked at my hands, the scars from the Vigilance Bridge still visible on my knuckles. "Is it worth it, Lucy? The seat? The power? The peace? Look at what we had to do to her to get it." Lucy looked at the massive obsidian cathedral towering over us. "I used to think there was a right answer to that. I used to think there was a way to save everyone and keep your hands clean. But Thorne was right about the calculus. You don't get to choose whether you pay a price. You only get to choose which price you're willing to live with." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, printed photograph. It was Cora, standing in a field of green grain on the rebuilt Oakhaven. She was laughing, her hair blowing in the wind, holding the lopsided bear high above her head. "She's happy, Kaylin," Lucy said. "She's safe, and she's never going to know what a stasis crate feels like. That's the bargain. We carry the memory of the fire so she can enjoy the warmth." Lucy left an hour later, heading for the transit docks. I stayed in the garden, watching the stars. My reflection in the obsidian wall was that of a diplomat, polished and poised, but beneath the blue coat, I could still feel the vibration of the ghost drive. I could still hear the scream of the Valon ring as it tore apart. I realized then that my transformation wasn't about the title or the seat. It was about the loss of the luxury of being quiet. For 30 years, we had the comfort of being the victim, the species that could complain about the unfairness of the universe from a position of moral superiority. Now, we were the ones who held the hammer. And the weight of that hammer was more exhausting than any war. I stood up and walked back toward the council chamber. As I passed the Thraxian delegation, the ambassador, a young, jittery male, practically tripped over himself to bow to me. I didn't smile. I didn't scowl. I just nodded with the same cold, clinical precision that Thorne had taught me. I took my seat in the second chair. The High Arbiter was vibrating, opening a session on mineral rights in the rim. I pulled up my data shard and began to work. I wasn't just filing a form. I was marking a boundary. I was making sure that the silence of the 41st species remained a wall that no one would ever dare to climb again. I spend a lot of time these days looking at the stars through the thick, reinforced glass of the High Council's chambers. From up here, the galaxy looks like a masterpiece of order. A billion points of light spinning in a perfect, predictable dance. For a long time, I wanted to believe that humanity could be a part of that dance, that we could blend into the rhythm and find peace in the harmony of others. I thought being civilized meant learning to speak the language of people who didn't want to hear us. But sitting in this chair, wearing this coat that feels like a shroud, I understand the truth that Admiral Thorne saw in the red pulse of a distress signal. We aren't part of the dance. We are the friction that keeps it from spinning into the void. We are the species that remembers the darkness so clearly that we are willing to become it to protect the light. I look at the scars on my hands, and I realize I'm not the man I was when I first stepped onto the Vigilant. That version of me died in the stasis rooms of Aegis 9, along with the naive idea that justice is something that is given to you by a committee. Justice isn't a gift. It's a tax you levy against the cruel. I am a monster in a blue coat, a predator sitting at a table of prey, and I have accepted that this is my purpose. We protect the future not by being perfect, but by being the warning that keeps the predators at bay. We are the price the galaxy pays for its peace. I often wonder, as I watch the new families settling on the colonies we fought to protect, if they will ever truly understand the calculus of their own safety. I see them living their quiet lives, oblivious to the names of the 322 people who died to keep their beds warm. It makes me wonder about your world, too. We all live in the shelter of walls built by people we will never meet, paid for with a currency of sacrifice we rarely acknowledge. I ask you this, from my seat in the back row of a galaxy that finally learned to listen. In your own life, who are the quiet observers who stood in the fire so you could walk through the cool grass? And if the time ever came, would you be willing to be the one who burns so that someone you've never met can sleep without fear? The session lasted until 2400 hours. As I walked back to my quarters, I stopped by the observation deck. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small blue Velcro strap, a piece of a shoe I'd found in the dirt of Kalyx-4 a long time ago. I let it go, watching it drift into the recycler bin. I didn't need the memento anymore. The memory was in my bones. I turned away from the stars and walked into the quiet, dark hallway of the station, my footsteps echoing with the steady, rhythmic beat of a heart that was no longer afraid of the dark. The sun was up on Oakhaven, and for now, that was enough.